Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, here for another Sunday with y'all. So you don't have to watch Meet the Press or Face the Nation or any of those choices. We give you something a little more interesting, I hope, and a little more relevant to what's actually going on in the world. And my guest and cohort today is Seth Sturm, formerly the chair and co-chair of the West Virginia Democratic Party Indigenous Caucus, and now one of the many people attempting to make the West Virginia Democratic Party look like they should, which fortunately they do quite a bit on their own. Seth, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Chris. How are you?
I am full of mirth, of course. Obviously, there's always the problem of we're shooting ourselves in the foot left and right. I think the real defining moment of this election was this past week when Uncommitted said, actually, we take it back. We can't endorse Kamala Harris, but we're really scared to tell you to vote for Jill Stein. So we're going to tell you to vote for Kamala Harris, even though we can't endorse her. They didn't use those words, but that was the effective argument they were making in their lack of endorsement for Kamala Harris that really ended up being an endorsement.
You have to be careful whenever you position yourself a certain way within an organization. Their whole movement was named Uncommitted, but at the end of the day, they wanted to force an action, and they failed ultimately. They weren't able to make progress, and so they said, okay, well, it's actually not that big of a deal to us because there's larger issues, which is the calculus that the Democrats have taken, right? Every time you bring up something that's wrong with the party, the answer is always, it's going to be worse under Trump. There's like this veiled threat of violence that they're so willing to use to get you to support this candidate, where you can't support Palestinians. The Palestinians are, they'll say things like, well, if Donald Trump gets in there, he's going to wipe it off the face of the earth. Or they'll do the thing where they say, Hamas doesn't support LGBTQ people. What are you doing? And there's this kind of attempt to divide everybody from one another within the realm of social justice and equity globally.
I'm just going to go ahead and go straight and simple since you're here and you're an Indigenous person. What do you feel? How do you feel about the idea that there are bigger issues than Indigenous genocide?
Well, here's the thing. I can simultaneously say that for me personally, and I know people say this, I'm probably going to vote third party, Jill Stein, no doubt. I believe in that, growing that movement. Do I want to see Donald Trump win over Kamala Harris? No, I don't necessarily want to see that, right? I believe you can hold multiple positions at the same time and believe your actions and choose which actions you take based on what the outcome is going to be. And I hate whenever they ascribe, that's what I say, whenever they say, well, you're not going to vote for that. Well, then this is going to result in a worse outcome for this marginalized group. There's no good outcome for that marginalized group. That's the first place we have to start. So if that's a concern, let's talk about how do we get positive outcomes for that marginalized group. But that's never the conversation that they're looking to have. That's, to me, is the same disingenuous kind of fake, what's the word I'm looking for here? They weaponize the language of liberation. I've been saying that since I came out of the Indigenous Caucus in the West Virginia Democratic Party. They want to make it seem like this is the way you support trans rights, the Palestinian rights. But at the end of the day, we're still supporting policies. And I still say we because I am terminally a Democrat. I can't help it. It's the fight I'm in. That's the language I use. But the Democrats, we want to position ourselves all the time as this morally superior group. But when we really get down to the actions beyond the words, it almost never backs up this idea that there will be positive change for anybody that's in one of these marginalized groups. So I hate the weaponization of it. I hate whenever these mostly unaffected people are trying to intellectualize atrocities the globe over. That's not okay. That's not the way. So you're conceding so much ground and so much power that you have because again, we don't have a lot of power as individual citizens.
Well,
the only thing we can do is voice our concerns, show up, and vote how we can make the most change. That's why I'm not a huge Green Party supporter here in West Virginia, the Mountain Party.
I've never been a huge Green Party supporter, but practically speaking, Jill Stein is the candidate on enough ballots to actually make a difference. I mean, if it were a matter of personal preference, I would be openly and full-throatedly supporting Joseph Kishore, who I've had on my show and who I don't agree with on everything, but who is really, really good on COVID, labor, and foreign policy, which are the three things that I think matter most right now. And he understands that capitalism is a genocidal nightmare that's killing us all. And that Palestine is just one expression of how this is happening. I mean, on a lesser scale, your experiences in the Democratic Party in West Virginia are kind of the same thing as people who are useful as symbols of what a good job the white saviors are doing are advanced as long as they advance the careers of white saviors, while people who actually try to stand up for Indigenous or Black or Palestinian or disabled issues within the Democratic Party get stepped on and told to shut up.
Exactly. And so let me go ahead and say, I've said I'm a Democrat, right? Everybody that's a fact. Even still, I can look at this race and say the Democratic Party has gone so far away from what I believed it to be when I signed up that I can see we need a third party alternative to the Democrats to force these party people into supporting the policies they say that they want to support. It's not this dichotomy that we've created between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats and the Republicans is driving a lot of the issues that we see systemically. So we need something to shock that system, and a viable third party is the way that I believe it great for the Green Party. I won't probably be a part of the Green Party ever, but I can use their rise to pressure people within the Democratic Party to be more democratic, to be more authentic in their rhetoric and in their actions. We all have our place in this society. We all have ways that we can work to make things better. And so it's crazy to me how much fighting, like AOC going hard against Jill Stein because she's some sort of threat. Use that energy elsewhere. We have to look at the bigger picture and how we can shock this system without change from the lawmakers, because we're not going to get that. We need to do outside work.
I'm going to bring something up before we transition to disability rights and the fact that the Democrats and the Republicans are the same on a bunch of issues, and then straight to disability rights. But in the 1960s, a man named Bayard Rustin, who was both a member of the Democratic Party who had personal access to people like Bobby Kennedy Sr. I mentioned Bobby Kennedy Sr. in this current political environment because RFK Jr. has been in the news for some of the family characteristics that have made trouble for the Kennedys over the years. But those issues aside, Bayard Rustin was a man who was both deep in the civil rights movement with personal access to Martin Luther King Jr. and deep in the Democratic Party with personal access to Bobby Kennedy. Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and others who were members of the Socialist Party of America believed that they could realign the Democratic Party around the labor movement and the civil rights movement in such a way that they could change the class character of the Democratic Party and make it a working class black party, and therefore an actual revolutionary party as opposed to a counter-revolutionary party. Sounds like a great plan, right? This was in the 1960s. In the 1980s, Bayard Rustin was working with CIA and Ronald Reagan to fight the Cold War in Poland. So when people say you don't change the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party changes you, that's what they're talking about.
Again, I mean, that's to me that's why
you're fighting against. Yes.
That's right. We have to have something completely change the structure and the makeup of this system. We need the rise of multiple parties. We need to force change from the outside in. This insular group of lawmakers has created this social club. There's a strata. The study showing that they don't respond to public opinion because they don't. So we've got to do more to get to those people. Listen, protesting is fine. It's great. It has its place. It really does. But at a certain point, you've got to grow something beyond those protests. I think at this point, we know there's an issue. There's a lot of support for this issue. It's time to mobilize in a way that brings action. So in this case, that's why I'm saying in November, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein, even though I'm a Democrat, even though I don't want to see Donald Trump win. I know that to some people, they'll hear those two things and it doesn't make sense. To me, in my calculus, the way I'm looking at this, it makes sense. It serves my goals. It serves the larger interests, because otherwise, it's one of the only things I can see that I can do right now that could make any kind of difference. If we manage to break through that threshold and create this semi-viable third party, something to pressure everybody to be more authentic.
At the most basic level, if we want to see more revolutionary action from the people who have been protesting up until now, then they have to, then the people who are doing the protesting and the people who are thinking about joining the protests and the people who are maybe thinking about finding something more effective than protesting to bring other people on board will start understanding the lack of scope for reform through elections at this point in our cycle. I want to note that there's a limit to how much reform, this is from the point of view of the ruling class, of course. There's a limit to how much room there is in the system for reform right now, because they feel they need those military and police expenditures in order to maintain control. And that means there isn't much left for anything else, especially since they want people to get poorer so they can get richer. And there's a limit to what elections can do about that. And those people have to be afraid of something more than just elections. And for that to happen, people have to feel that they don't have much to lose, because elections aren't really getting them anywhere. At which point I will start my pivot by saying, the number one frustration for anybody who wants to vote to make things better is that on a host of issues, cops, COVID, Palestine, the Democrats and the Republicans are the same. And on top of that, worse, more radical groups that are organizing around marginalized people and their issues are absorbing their way of looking at things from this lens shaped by our corporate media that serves the same ruling class as our corporate parties. I want to mention an article by a friend of the show that was published recently about something that happened in July, which was that the the New York chapter, which is the home chapter and founding chapter of the AIDS activist organization ACT UP, had a huge social media and internal political fiasco over COVID denial and the rights of disabled people to fully participate in society, or even in activism to change society. As you saw a vicious anti-mask thread written under an account associated with the organization by a person who just happened to have a friend with social media, with access to the social media account, and they just decided to do this without talking to anybody on ACT UP's COVID working group, which they have, or anyone in ACT UP's communications team other than the person with account access who wrote the thread. Now, this led to a huge explosion on social media. I don't know if you noticed at the time, but disabled people, especially disabled people with multiple health issues who are in ACT UP because they're HIV positive, but who are also suffering from long COVID and multiple other issues, are being told to shut up and not wear a mask, and are being thrown out of the organization or suspended from the organization now for having spoken to the journalist who wrote the article about what happened in July. Now, they had a big internal meeting about this where they had very open and aggressive confrontations about how people should be addressing the issue of masking. And I think it's wild because on the most basic issue, you would think that an AIDS activist organization would understand that masks are like condoms.
Well, isn't it also prudent for especially that organization to consider the immunocompromised in the larger discussion around COVID?
That's the wild part. The person who, because remember, we're talking about ACT UP. The person who wrote the thread is themselves HIV positive and immunocompromised and at risk, but who is blatantly getting mad at other at-risk people for caring to agree they don't.
And what drives that, too, is it's really concerning. I don't understand why this issue of people protecting themselves. I mean, we're seeing cities now enacting mask bans. I mean, this is
excellent, because this is a good thing to talk about, because I'm glad you mentioned the mask ban specifically. This feeds back into the story. One of the people who was thrown out or suspended was the only person who went on the record with our friend Justine. Her name was Bridget Jones. She has multiple health issues. She was one of the people who went on behalf of ACT UP New York to Nassau County to argue against mask bans for disabled people. On behalf of disabled people. She was treated horribly by Nassau County politicians and law enforcement. But they're angry that she spoke to a journalist about ACT UP New York's issues on the record, and apparently they're claiming it's because she didn't tell them she spoke to a journalist until after the fact. And they seem to say that's the real reason that this person was thrown out. But it seems like butthurt.
Well, okay, so how does that match up to? So this is my thing is rules for organizations considering what's happened to me with the Indigenous Caucus, right? So what's the difference between somebody going rogue and issuing a public statement, a public communication out to the masses that says this thing that's highly contentious within the group, right? They didn't have authorization to do that. Now, this person responds by basically communicating publicly, but through a journalist who's writing a story. One is punishable by removal. The other is just a mistake. It's the same situation kind of that I went through here. I mean, the rules are only applied to those who they want to target, and it's up to leadership and the structure that is to go through these internal grievance processes, or to enact which rules, or to determine which rules should be followed and when. And when you don't have that consistency, you don't have any way to actually operate legitimately within that organization. You're at the whim of those in power.
Now, the positive of all this is for the internal controversy at the meeting that Justine wrote about led to a really great apology, success, correctly citing the eugenics that immunocompromised people are facing from this system, and the fact that anti-mask propaganda is itself pro-eugenics propaganda, and members of the organization who are themselves being immunocompromised people being targeted by eugenics. I mean, we're still only actually saving the lives of AIDS patients who can afford treatment, let's remember. This is America, after all. Lots of people are still dying of AIDS in Africa because they can't get the drugs that are sold in America for the same prices they are sold in America and Europe.
Well, and it speaks to the way in which intersectionality of sorts comes into play here. Even within this community, there are different levels of need, and there are different considerations to be had. So whenever somebody from a group is telling you something, it's worth at least listening. They may not always be right. They may not have the right to speak for their entire group, but it's worth listening instead of immediately coming back and responding forcefully against that person. Is there something larger here at play? And having open discourse is important. I'm glad that they had some sort of internal discussion about this where they really discussed it. It seems that's something that didn't happen for me in the Democratic Party. No conversation has happened around whether or not discrimination or any violation of our civil rights ever happened. It's not an option. It's obfuscate and distract. So you have to be willing to address those issues head on. That's a positive, depending on the outcome, right? So, but it's so frustrating whenever you're in these situations and people don't recognize the importance of inclusivity and diversity of thought. A lot of times you want check boxes. We had a disabled, this type of person. We had this type of person. We are, presenting ourselves as having been comprehensive in our coverage or our analysis, whatever it is. But when there's no real substantive input from everybody, when you shut them down and don't listen, you're in a situation where you're engaging in a lot of those marginalizing practices that we have to fight against.
This raises a really important question that I'm interested in asking you, because you've experienced this in the form of racial discrimination. I know people who've experienced this in the form of ableism of the kind we're talking about with the ACT UP New York story. So then the question becomes, how do you create a system of collective organizing for collective action that doesn't leave out marginalized people? Because, I mean, in the end, you not only need to have marginalized people, but leadership from the marginalized community in order to actually overthrow a system like this.
And one of the problems that we really run into is the fractured nature of, let's say, the resistance. I'm speaking now about the Democratic Party to give an example of how this works. We're fighting. The Indigenous Caucus has been fighting, trying to get recognition, trying to be allowed to have a seat at the table beyond just having our faces there. There are other groups going through similar things, right? So there's a official who's a trans woman who was targeted by the party and basically forced out of her committee. She filed an affidavit with her county court system. I don't know who she did it with, but I reached out to her and I said, stand with the Indigenous Caucus. She stands with us in spirit, I guess, in some ways, but wouldn't publicly go with us. So now she's preparing her own battle against the party. Well, here's the thing. If you work with other people, you can build this massive group to counter that larger group. But if each individual faction goes up and fights their own little battle, we're going to all lose, because we do. They have that ability to shut down any individual or any small grouping. When people that are marginalized can come together in some sort of, I don't know, confederation, whatever you want to say, to really organize, it's kind of, decentralized. I don't know how to put it. I mean, we're going to have to start working together, individual organizations and groups with one another, to kind of form a larger goal, towards a larger goal of fighting back against marginalization. We have to identify the issue and how we want to combat it, but people have to start working together more. I think that's a real issue, and I don't know how to do it myself. But
what you're talking about is actually a real thing. The founder of the Democratic People's Party of Kurdistan, who is in a Turkish prison for trying to make Kurdistan a real thing and not just aspirational, calls it democratic confederalism, which is the idea that various groups who are opposed to the way things are come together and fight together against the oppressor and run their own communities the way they want to and do their internal business democratically while making democratic agreements with other groups within the organization and having things move horizontally instead of vertically when it comes to lines of authority. In theory, this is what is supposedly happening in Rojava. In a more directly free of the CIA sort of way, this is what's happening in parts of Mexico, where the Zapatistas are in de facto control, despite the fact that the Mexican government still claims ultimate jurisdiction. There are things that people can do, but they have to feel motivated to do them. I think that it becomes important for us to start thinking about how to build these sorts of inclusive organizations. Because, I mean, we're going to need disabled people. We're going to need Indigenous people. We don't want to be excluding people and making them feel marginalized within an organization that's supposed to defend their interests.
Right. And I think back to, I did a podcast with Marianne Clater in 2017 called Take a Stand with Marianne. And we had a guest on, and he's kind of like me, working within the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure how well the book would be received, but it's called Hegemony How To, a Roadmap for Radicals. And in it, he analyzes the structure of a lot of political organizations. And one of the things he identified that tends to happen with these organizations, you start off kind of broad, you build your power, you build up your leadership structure, your power structure, you get influences in, and then things start to become more and more insular. People start to battle for control of that organization because it becomes more of a social club, more of a status thing to be in your organization, and you want to keep other people out because you don't want to lose what you have. And eventually you kind of just fizzle. And we see this happen with, look at Occupy Wall Street. I was younger, and in 2011, I was very pumped about the prospects of real change coming. But it just ultimately starts to go out. They didn't transition.
In their defense, Obama told all the Democratic mayors of all the big cities in the country with Occupy encampments, just send the cops in to hit them on the head.
Well, Jonathan Smucker is the author of that book, and he was part of the original group that started the first sit-in, whatever you want to call it. He critiques the way in which there was a vacuum. There was no real transition from, we did this thing that got a lot of attention, now we're going to engage people at the right levels with the right message. That didn't happen. So it's kind of the same thing, because they got built up on their ideology.
Well,
this is what he says, built up on that ideology of leaderless movement, that there was a missed opportunity.
They were sidetracked. They were sidetracked into an argument about methods and tactics. Chris Hedges, who is who I understand is very popular in a great many circles for his uncompromising and very, very principled opposition to imperialism and the destruction of the environment, became obsessed with the idea that black bloc was bad, that the people who were acting to defend Occupy protesters from police violence were bad, that engaging in violence in self-defense in response to police rioting against you was bad, was undermining the organization, and had to be stamped out. This was sort of your first anti-Antifa screed from someone purporting to be on the left. The late David Graeber, who I wish was still with us to speak about some of the LaRoucheite trend of what purports to be the anti-imperialist movement these days, aggressively defended Black Bloc, said that you had to organize for self-defense, and that self-defense against violence was necessary if you were going to survive to effectively resist. Now, this just led to a big argument. It was essentially the end of organized Occupy activity while they were having this argument. At the same time, Obama was bashing people on the head. You were seeing the so-called Occupy Democrats appear in the political system, demanding more progressive policy for the 99%. And of course, Occupy Democrats was the latest in a long spiel of organizations that start out as Justice Democrats and end up as Just Us Democrats.
That's a perfect example of, I picked Occupy Wall Street, but you just picked another one. You see how it changes, right? The original idea becomes something else based upon the needs of those within the organization.
The Occupy Democrats were so-called progressive Democrats claiming to provide progressive national voice to the demands made by regional Occupy Wall Street groups, except, of course, they were just another Democratic Party group. It was like the uncommitted national organization stepping in to hijack the efforts of the actual uncommitted activists in Michigan.
Well, that's completely, then you're talking about groups that are fraudulently, in a way, using that, they knowingly are co-opting, let's say, that language in order to get with it. So there's so many different conversations and so many barriers and obstacles that organizers are going to have to overcome. And like I said, I don't have all the answers. If I did, I would have some of these organizations already up and running, wouldn't I?
It's true.
So it's just, at this point, it's kind of a thought about, when you get involved, how can we make sure to avoid these known pitfalls. At this point, everybody, the more people who are aware of it, the more people who could say, hey, our group is now starting to kind of seem toxic. We're not bringing in new people. We're not growing. We're not going to become a force. We're going to become an insular group whose social, I don't know, our idea of ourselves will be grander than what we actually accomplish. That's the idea here, is that they get so caught up and believe everything that they're doing is so important. But unless that translates to something real, something actionable, something tangible, well, it's not important. You've wasted a lot of time and energy on something that's not important. Like I have, at the end of the day, I started thinking, why, if the Democrats don't want an Indigenous caucus, then it's best the Democrats don't have an Indigenous face to tout out there and say, hey, we've got these people too.
Well, it's like you said on Twitter. Imagine if the West Virginia Democratic Party Indigenous Caucus still existed, and the West Virginia Democratic Party was hiding behind your face personally to hand wave what's going on in Palestine right now and support Kamala Harris.
Exactly. And there are rules that basically say you're to support these candidates publicly if you're an official. I'd have to double check the bylaws now, that may or may not have changed, but at one point it was used in order to keep people positive. Your goal is to help the party first and foremost.
Well, I'm glad you're speaking out of school on this, because this is something I've long suspected, but I've never had anyone come out and tell me before. Because
I'll have to double check the language. Let me double check. What I'm thinking of right now, though, for sure, was in 2018, Marianne Clater wrote an op-ed about Joe Manchin. And in it, she called him, she said something about, how can we expect change when we allow the devil to sit at the head of our table? And so she was sitting on the board of the Federation of Women at that time.
yes.
And she was removed for inciting discontent or something that they came up with. So there have been times when speaking out has had people removed. Now she's back on the board of the Federation of Women. But she's persevered. But
since you mention her name, it's kind of weird that the only black candidate for statewide office wasn't in that NAACP event a couple of weeks ago. I'm off topic now, but
well, hey, it's a great opportunity to kind of draw everything back in, talking about the way in which the rhetoric doesn't match the actions for these Democrats, and especially here in West Virginia. That's what I can speak to. You have, this is known. This may not be publicly mentioned, but I've seen proof of all of this. They have, the Democratic Party here treats 3 of their candidates as the dream team. That's what they call them. Steve Williams for governor, who's okay, way better than Patrick Morrisey. I don't have any ill will towards Steve Williams directly. Glenn Elliott for Senate. I've heard him say some things at different meetings when he didn't think anyone was listening that personally I don't like him. Better than Jim Justice? Probably. I don't know. No, I got nothing to say about him.
I mean, let's all be honest. Better than millionaire who switched parties because Donald Trump killed an investigation into whether blowing the tops off of mountains might be bad for the environment is a low bar.
It is. But again, I'd have no real issue with him. Now, the third member of the dream team is the Attorney General candidate, Teresa Torreseva. She has, let's just say there's a lot going on with her. She's pro-cop union, super pro-cop, actually filed a lawsuit against towns that were having oversight for police. It was, I forget, you'd have to look into it. It was a few years ago. And she,
so basically you're saying she's a lawyer for cop unions, it almost sounds like.
Well, and other things, but yeah, she also has sued the police on occasion. She's just an attorney, but whenever it was needed, she was the attorney for the police union. But the thing about this is, there's this structure that's been unwritten rule. There's a hierarchy on the ballot, and for whatever reason, the Attorney General sits below state auditor. Normally, the state auditor is considered a higher position in West Virginia. That's the supervisor of the Board of Public Works. They kind of get a little bit of an extra bump once they get elected. Mary Ann Claytor has been largely ignored. So, for example, the party partially funded a poll, and they reached out to the Dream Team, and at a discounted price, got statewide polling for them about their races. They didn't contact Mary Ann Claytor or include her in that polling. The candidates only paid a fraction of the cost of the polling. They spent $16,000 on the polling. The candidates together spent, I think, $6,000 of that. The party and other funders paid for the remaining $10,000.
I want to go ahead and reiterate at this point that the Dream Team are all white folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning that Mary Ann Claytor has signed off on every grievance. Well, maybe not every grievance, but on one of the grievances against the West Virginia Democratic Party for racial discrimination in 2021. And she and the other Black Caucus chair signed off on the DNC challenge that the Indigenous Caucus members filed with the national party that was dismissed without hearing it. So there's a bit of retaliation that was going on, possibly. When she was, so she's being excluded from all of these things. So then there was this, I tell you all of that to talk about the NAACP WVU meeting. There's the NAACP chapter, or the WVU affiliate chapter of the NAACP West Virginia. They had a Meet the Candidates night that was co-sponsored with several student union groups and nonprofit organizations. And oh man, I wish you could share the graphic that they used. They put front and center Teresa Torreseva, front and center on Meet the Candidates night, and then all these white men around her. They said it was an oversight. We didn't know Mary Ann Claytor was running. That was one of the stories that they said. It was an oversight. These students just missed it. Another person said, well, this was put together by a board member and they chose the candidates they wanted. Another person said these specific candidates reached out to the board to have this event. But the overall, the end result was that this NAACP, Black Student Union, Muslim students of WVU, Sierra Club, maybe, don't quote me on that one. They had this Meet the Candidates event hosted by the NAACP West Virginia University branch, and they excluded Mary Ann Claytor, the only Black candidate, statewide candidate in West Virginia. It's just amazing to see the influence that the Democratic Party can have over these different seemingly independent organizations. Because here's the kicker. Mary Ann wrote the co-sponsors of that event about that event a month before, asking to just have a moment to speak to the gathering. And she was completely ignored until a few Black leaders within the state, like Danielle Walker, Martise Washington, started raising the issue on social media to them. And at that point, they called and apologized to Mary Ann, saying that it was an unfortunate misunderstanding, all of this. But at the end of the day, we have this situation where the Dream Team was invited by the NAACP to speak to presumably a largely Black audience, right? And it's crazy to witness the way that she can be excluded when, honestly, I'm not making this up. I know she is my friend. I'll be honest. I don't work for her anymore, but she is one of my best friends. Just so there is no conflict. I am biased. But when you look at the facts, in West Virginia, there is one statewide candidate that has a chance to win, and that's Mary Ann Claytor. Her opponent was a Democrat for over 20 years, a Democratic donor, tens of thousands of dollars to the Democratic Party of West Virginia, switched in 2022. The Republicans do not consider him one of their own. There's no loyalty there. The guy has ran statewide before and lost. He's lost several elections in the past. He's just not a...
Isn't this guy connected to some sort of weird cloning scandal?
So that's my podcast. I have it in my bio there. The Nitro Files is a podcast that I'm working on. In 2001, this guy, Mark Hunt, contacted...
Who's running for Attorney General now.
He's running for state auditor now.
State auditor. That's right. Thank you.
And he teamed up. So it's a heartbreaking story, honestly. His infant son passed away, and he got this idea that cloning would be a viable option. He reached out, reportedly reached out to I think came out that there was one organization, but anyway, he ended up teaming up with this group called Clonaid, which is the scientific research arm of the Raelian movement, which is a cult that believes that aliens seeded life on this planet using cloning, and that we can achieve immortality through cloning, downloading our consciousness to a computer and then re-uploading it into a new version of yourself. They teamed up, and Mark Hunt funded this endeavor in Nitro, West Virginia. What they did was they sourced secondhand equipment from a fertility clinic. Mark Hunt started a company called BioServe here in West Virginia with the stated intent of researching DNA. It was to research DNA, but the actual goal was him with Clonaid would go through the same procedure that Dolly the sheep.
And for the record, for people who aren't familiar with UFO speculation, Raelianism is essentially, for lack of a better word, a cult that believes aliens are angels.
It's interesting. So in this podcast, what we're going to do, because I found this story doing research on Mark Hunt, but it stood out to me because nobody got in trouble. Everybody walked away. The story was focused on, hey, cloning. Where are we at with cloning? And not what almost happened to all of these human research subjects that they were going to use. Dolly the sheep was created using 277 pregnancies. They implanted 277 embryos into healthy sheep.
Yeah.
And they had to, there were major defects and issues with all of the fetuses. Yeah. So this same trial and error process was going to be done on humans.
And Dolly ended up dying horribly because of a genetic breakdown.
Right. So what we're going to do in this is go back to this story and re-examine it through this 2024 lens of who was almost harmed, what was the human cost, and then kind of ask the question, why did everyone get away with this? Why did the media not focus on...
And this guy is running for state auditor now.
And honestly, I love Marianne. There's a good chance he'll be state auditor. It's scary. The story is shocking. I mean, the experts I'm talking to and interviewing have likened this to Nazi experimentation.
Mengele stuff. No, yeah, there's a movie from the 70s with Gregory Peck called The Boys from Brazil, which is about Mengele cloning Hitler in post-World War II South America.
One of my experts, Dr. Jonathan Moreno, we're going to discuss that movie explicitly because one of the things is pop culture. One of the reasons why people didn't think, what's the process of cloning? What would be the human cost? Is because pop culture and sci-fi has kind of given us this desensitized view of what science is. You push a button, this thing's done magically on TV. You don't think about what
they usually don't go into exactly what experiments did Lex Luthor do in order to be able to clone himself to come back from his own apparent death of cancer.
Exactly. So when people heard cloning, they're just thinking, oh, okay, he was going to clone. But the reality was mass abortions, mass trauma to the women who would be subjected to these treatments, so even harvesting the eggs needed to create the embryos that would be implanted, you would need more women to do that. And it's extremely taxing. So like in 2024, we now have really strict rules about the way in which we engage medical research with test subjects.
Bioethics.
Changed. Right. So we're exploring bioethics. We're exploring the science of cloning. It's going to be hopefully a very fascinating reexamination of this.
I'm
story that,
just still stuck on this whole notion that somebody who was involved in a Boys from Brazil scheme may be state auditor of Virginia. I mean, West Virginia.
Well, and here's the thing too. This is what concerns me about that, is that he's never shown any remorse about what he did. He said that he would pursue it if there was another place where he could get it done, he would do it. Which, when you even just look at the ethics of reproductive cloning, one of my experts came on and gave me great information about. There's no legitimate reason for cloning a human. It would only be used as an instrument for either research, or you created it to fulfill some need within yourself. That person that's being created would never have its autonomy. Basically, it's created unethically for the purpose of some instrumentation. So the idea that you can just, the whole thing is disturbing. There's a lot psychologically that we got to examine about intent versus impact. Like, the intention here, I do believe is pretty pure, but what you're willing to do to get this thing that you think you want, or that would make you better, it's
well, this brings to mind a Far Side comic that had a kid with glasses writing on the chalkboard, "I will not play in God's domain. I will not play in God's domain," over and over again. And it says underneath, it's the caption, "The young Victor Frankenstein is kept after school."
Well, and here's one other thing, just to kind of, so you've got all of these other issues, but just the hypocrisy of somebody who's now a Republican, very pro-life, to the point of supporting abortion bans, was going to engage in medical research that would have, without a doubt, ended in mass abortions. That's what we're talking about. There would have been many trial and errors. They bragged about the fact that they were going to monitor the pregnancies, and anything went wrong, they would terminate the pregnancy.
The fact that you have to get stem cells from aborted genetic material was the reason that Republicans had opposed stem cell research in the first place in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Exactly. And so in that realm, a lot of this science that related to this particular type of reproductive cloning research, it's out the window. There's nobody even really doing this. So this story, it's worth noting, is, as far as I've talked to these people that I'm interviewing for the show, this is the only time in the history of the world that there has been an attempt to create a clandestine human cloning lab. It's the only time it's happened. And everybody walked away. Everybody signed a piece of paper saying we won't do it again.
Makes me wonder if CIA isn't running new labs somewhere.
Well, so it's because it's this type of research is basically not needed anymore because we're into gene editing. Mm-hmm. So now the discussion about bioethics is, well, how do we determine which genes we should be editing? Are there certain things that are so horrible that the world can agree? But then you're getting into eugenics. You're getting into, I mean, this is such an interesting topic. I so much deeper than I ever would have imagined when I first found it. This is
one of the reasons that I think there really are certain areas of, because the question becomes not just, all right, well, what's the scientific basis for all this idea? But then it also becomes, okay, what is the implication of actually doing anything with this science? What would the purpose be? What would we possibly gain? What are the costs?
Exactly. That's the whole thing. That's basically, when you're talking about cloning research, any kind, or gene editing, you're getting into the why.
Yeah.
Is it ethical? Is this anything
even
that
beyond,
can be ethical?
even before we get to the is it ethical? You ask the practical question. Well, what are we wanting to do with this? And none of the answers are inspiring.
Exactly. And there's also this human sociological, I don't know what you would say it, anthropological, I don't know, about accepting life as it is, right? These people, the Raelians, they wanted to clone in order to extend their life, immortality.
Well, they want people to become immortal the way that the alien angels have become immortal. And the alien angels are trying to help us become immortal. And this cloning experiment is part of that process.
Right. And as I talk to these experts, it comes clear there's no perfect process. Each clone will be, the DNA will change a little bit, right?
Yes.
And if there is a soul, if there is a piece of you that's God-given, no amount of, you can't clone it. So
well, that's the whole thing. Have you ever seen, there's a great Michael Keaton movie on this topic called Multiplicity, where the dude clones himself because he needs more of himself to go around to fulfill his work obligations, his family obligations, to occasionally have some leisure time. And basically, but the trouble is that there was all these clones end up as actual people with their own personalities and drives and needs and desires.
That's I'm going to add that into the discussion around pop culture, probably, because that's exactly the reasoning here. You're creating something as an instrument. You want it to fulfill some need for yourself if you're going to do any kind of reproductive cloning. That's the thought. So what are you going to do whenever that turns out to be a human? Okay, you perfected it. You've created your clone. It's not going to either replace the person you want to replace. It's not going to be you. You're not going to be able to put your consciousness into it and what, I mean, maybe in the future, I doubt it.
That's the piece that's in all these, that's the piece that is in all of these science fiction or comic book stories about cloning that is somehow sort of, the guy puts his own brain into the clone's body somehow so that he lives on in the clone. Now you think about that, you're creating a person just to kill it and steal its body.
Exactly. It's just, I mean, honestly, this is one of the most interesting things that I've stumbled across in all of my opposition research for political candidates. I mean, I read this and it went beyond Mark Hunt. My mind didn't go, how can I use this for Marianne Claytor? It went to, nobody knows the real. You hear about the cloning, you kind of whispers. This is me in politics. So regular people probably don't even hear that. Nobody told me the depth of this. Nobody told me the scope and the scale of this. Nobody told me about the Raelians or immortality or the process or the fact that this was done. Like, some of the reporting at the time refers to the unsanitary conditions of the place. It sounds like something out of a horror story. I mean, it's really
awful. This is the plot of multiple horror stories.
Right. And yet somehow this guy was able to create a company to do DNA research, almost do human medical, I don't even know what you would call it, using human subjects against, and also, by the way,
like Jimmy Dore and Bobby Kennedy Jr. are worried about vaccines.
Right. And here's, you know, one of the things that we're talking about is informed consent, which has become a code word for anti-vaxxers too.
Yeah.
So we're going to examine what informed consent is really all about. Now, I don't know if we'll get into anti-vaxxing, but the women who were going to be used, who volunteered to be the research subjects, were all members of the Raelian cult.
Of course they were.
So we're talking about psychological manipulation, whether or not somebody in these groups could actually consent to something like this. It's deep. It's fascinating. And there's so many ways in which this relates and can be taken.
And I'm still stuck on the idea. I'm still stuck on the idea that the Democratic Party of West Virginia is not sufficiently supporting Marianne Claytor against this guy.
You would think, I mean,
I mean, just this, they're not, why Why is the Democratic Party of West Virginia not taking serious action to stop this guy? Why are we not hearing conversations about don't elect the human cloning fascist the way we're hearing you've got to stop Trump?
Well, and also, I can't speak to that. It bothers me a lot, but I hope that, and again, I hope Marianne wins. I hope that she's able to beat him on her own merits. This podcast won't make it before the election, I'm sure, so it won't even be a factor. But accountability still matters. So win or lose, everybody in this story got to walk away. And at least as society, okay, this actually goes to a personal.
Now this comes back into this whole eugenics and ableism argument, because ultimately, when you're talking about cloning, you're talking about finding ways to physically reproduce people without problems.
It's inherently that, especially the immortality idea. It's when your body becomes, useless, so to speak, because that's how they view it.
I'm just going to clone myself and grab this extra body. Well, that extra body came with a brain. What happened to that brain?
Yeah, and so the whole idea, when you start to really examine it, I can't imagine thinking about cloning and then going through the process of spending $500,000 in 2001 money, by the way, so that's more like $800,000-$900,000 now, to create an unsanitary.
It's worth noting that in both the boys from Brazil and the Marvel Comics stories that revolve around cloning, the big experts in cloning are all fucking Nazis. The people willing to do the stuff necessary to perfect cloning are always fucking Nazis. And there's a reason for this, because even though they don't get into the nitty-gritty, the people who are writing these stories where these experts in cloning are the bad guys understand on some level all of these implications of cloning a person and then using their body to be immortal.
Exactly. A lot of it. And so that's another great point, is how there seems to be an innate understanding in a lot of people. Like I say, the fascination of cloning kept people from really examining the atrocity that almost was. But at the same time, I think that people, when they think about cloning, it's that question of what's the purpose? What are you doing this for? I think most people have that thought, even if they aren't able to articulate it. There's an uneasiness that comes with the idea of cloning a person. It doesn't sit well, I think, with most people, religious, not religious. That you want to talk about a unifying issue. I think that this is one of the great unifiers, that people could come together, and whether you're a secular person, a left-wing person, a right-wing Christian, you can look at this and say, maybe there's reasons we shouldn't do it. It's against God if you're over here. And if you're on that side, you say, well, that's eugenics, it's Nazi.
And this is where I'm going to circle us back to ableism, since this is such a perfect example of ableism and eugenics in this freaky cloning thing. The journalist who wrote this article on ACT UP New York has said on her public-facing Twitter account that she's really losing faith in collectivism and collective organizing because of the inability of organizers to include disabled people. Now, obviously, you're not giving up. You if you will forgive my characterization of you in this way, it's meant in admiration and not in any way mocking. You have the demeanor of the gentleman who continues to bang his head against the wall, expecting the wall to break.
And maybe the wall will break, Chris. That's the thing. You don't know.
No, and maybe it will, and that's worth. But that said, I think that this feeds back. How do we? Because obviously, from Justine's journalism, she's exactly the person we need. These are the people we need telling these stories. But she says at the same time that she's losing faith in the actual capacity of people for collectivism without eugenics or ableism because of experiences that people are having at places like ACT UP New York, because of the anti-mask feeling in places like in organizations like DSA. This is the person who is writing the truth about criminal justice and disability justice and long COVID and not really getting nearly enough credit for it. And yet they feel like all that's left is individual action and collectivism is impossible and undesirable. Now, how do we get someone like that back?
Everybody has to make their own decision, right? I mean, if it becomes too much for any one person, you've got to step back, honestly. What we need is a support network. We've got to communicate. I like to remind people that 20 years ago, the internet looked nothing like it does today. Organizing in general has been evolving and transforming. And so we need to look at what's happened, maybe do a post-mortem analysis, so to speak, and really get some basic guidelines together for all organizations moving forward in this 21st century era of communication. I think that we're going to start identifying trends that are leading to the toxicity. One of the things being we determine who's worthy of speaking based upon how much influence they have. If somebody has a bigger following on social media and they come into your organization, people tend to say, well, what do they think? Because people pay attention to them without really doing that work that's needed within an organization to determine the best course forward. You might rely on something like that. So we need to determine what are the best practices for 21st century organizing and really start holding people accountable. These organizations, whether it's the Democratic Party, ACT UP, are insular, and the leadership usually has the ability to enact whatever they want, however they want. If they want to use rules to take somebody out that they don't like, they'll do it. If they want to ignore rules to give cover to somebody they do like or for their own position, they'll do it. And what recourse do a lot of people have? The way these things are set up a lot of times is the issue. So we have to look at restructuring perhaps the way in which we put them together. I mean, I don't necessarily have all of the answers, like I said, but I think that we're going to have to fundamentally re-examine this in this modern age. I don't think we have done that yet. I don't think we've adapted fully to the transformations that have happened over these last 4 or 5 decades. I mean, you go from the civil rights movements to what we're doing now. That's in somebody's lifetime. You know, somebody could have been active in both movements, right? What are the lessons we can learn from these past 50, 60 years of activism? And how can we reassess the way in which we structure our organizations, communicate with one another, and deal with larger systemic issues that we may all agree on, even though we come at it from different angles? You know, if we could find a way to work together, you can do death by 1,000 cuts, but everybody, so you don't need to have one overarching organization if everybody can come together in some way. And we have the technology now in order to facilitate these communications. That's what I'm saying ultimately. We've got to find a way to make it larger than any one organization can destroy, right? If an organization destroys itself, that's unfortunate, but we need to have a larger structure ready to absorb that loss. People need to be more connected in terms of ACT UP working with this group or that group or this other disability group. They should bolster one another and work to enact policies together that are mutually beneficial. So if there's something from ACT UP that this other organization can learn from and vice versa, they need to integrate those things while communicating with one another. It's not going to be one organization's doing such amazing work.
Let's remember that this isn't even a question of ACT UP coordinating with other organizations. This is a question of ACT UP having a major reckoning on the ableist and anti-sick person feelings of disabled sick people in their own organization.
So
and it's very complicated and dirty and revealing about human nature, because you're seeing people internalize the kind of attitudes that society has had against them.
So in my view, what would be the best situation is that groups, and this is where it comes into the insular nature, other groups should be trying to engage with the leadership of this organization to help correct the wrong from that's happening within. All of this, it's internal. We don't take things internal, external, all of this kind of hierarchy within is creating that insular nature. We need accountability from outside as well as inside with our organization. So if there's trouble and the issue is ableism, then multiple organizations should be trying to get together with that leadership to have a conference that says, we're not necessarily in your group, but let us help you understand why what you're doing is something that's in our wheelhouse, and we're going to make you stronger. And there needs to be this connection. So if somebody in that ACT UP organization has this issue, they know that, hey, it's not uncommon for us to work together and for me to take this internal issue external. And again, people who are in power don't want that. That's that insular nature. That's holding on to what you have, holding on to that influence. We've got to get past that and get to the place where we're actually working together to overcome these massive forces that are barriers to our participation, to our liberation, to our whatever it is. I mean, these things.
I'm going to say for a moment, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to say for a moment that based on what I just heard, if someone who is watching is wanting to clip one part of the show for a soundbite, here it is. Seth Sturm says ACT UP New York needs an intervention from other social justice organizations. I kind of agree with that.
Accountability doesn't happen from within. It just doesn't. You have to force people. And it needs to get to the point. Everyone acts, it's like children. I have little nieces. And when I'm watching them, if I tell them, okay, they do something, and I say, hey, don't do that. They start crying. Nobody likes to be told what to do. But at the same time, there's accountability. And so people have to get past that personal nature of the criticism. I'm not criticizing. Even these people within the Democratic Party, I don't necessarily mean for it to be a personal criticism as much as this is the thing that you're doing that we shouldn't do anymore.
That's a great quote, though. Accountability doesn't happen from within. I'm going to remember that. Thank you very much.
That's just my big belief. I don't understand why more people aren't more open. I feel like if we could communicate and be honest without having these ulterior motives or bad faith argumentation and lies. I mean, lies are a big problem within these organizations. They can smear you with impunity practically, and there's really little recourse. I mean, yeah, okay, defamation and slander is illegal. Good luck. Fine. I am telling you, we can't find a lawyer.
If you're a poor, disabled, HIV positive, disabled person, what are your chances of finding a lawyer to sue a disabled organization that is not necessarily itself wealthy?
You're not going to find. I can't find anyone right now that thinks civil rights is an issue to take on. Every lawyer I've contacted says there's not enough money to take on the Indigenous Caucus. Everyone says you might be right. This looks arguable, but there's no money in it. Is basically the consensus. And I would say, well, that's because we don't have any money. I can't pay you. So that's where we're at, But that's the truth. That's why they have the ability to do these things, because there aren't consequences.
And sadly, the Democratic Party of West Virginia had reached the point where its money was Joe Manchin's money, and Joe Manchin is an independent now. So the Democratic Party of West Virginia doesn't really have any money left.
They spent $100,000 in 2018 on mailers saying Joe Manchin votes 96% of the time with Donald Trump, or whatever the number was. And then he goes and becomes an independent. And I'm telling you, this party is in a place here in West Virginia that nobody should envy. There's no chance for us to take and make any gains. And I say us, anybody, to make any gains against this GOP that's becoming increasingly dangerous here in this state.
How many, I'm curious, you're in West Virginia. How many districts are there where the Democratic Party of West Virginia doesn't even run candidates?
I don't have the exact number. It was I feel like there was a percentage. It's I want to say something like 20%. Oh, you'll have to
Yeah, the
I think I
reason
wrote
I
about it
asked
one
is
time on my
because
Substack.
the reason I ask is because our colleague and acquaintance Zaina Day has done quite a bit of writing and talking about this topic over the years, which is that the Democratic Party doesn't even run candidates in a bunch of these red state districts. It's
Well, and I
like
know
the guy that they sued off the ballot in 2020 from the Green Party in Texas. The Democrats ended up not running a candidate against the Republican incumbent in that district. So basically, by suing the Green Party off the ballot, they ensured that the Republican was running for re-election unopposed.
and it's that kind of behavior that just you lose every bit of high ground that you have, claiming that you are supportive of democracy or whatever it is, or that you're fighting, doing everything you can to fight that GOP. Here in West Virginia, we had recruiting. They had recruiting meetings, leading up to the elections last year, and reportedly, no names mentioned here of who told me, but at one of these meetings, the chair of the party was basically like, "I've got people, I'm doing a lot of work, but wouldn't and couldn't probably explain what or where or who any of these people were supposedly." And then you see it come out. We don't have people running in a lot of these districts. It's just given to the Republicans.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's that they couldn't find anybody sufficiently aligned with them, or if they just couldn't find anybody in general. I don't know if they did the work to do it, but you're just giving it away at that point, and everybody focuses up on these higher levels, but you got to do the local stuff too. And again, I'm not saying one's more important than the other. They each have their role and their duties, and they each impact your life in some way.
Yeah.
But they ignore it. They ignore that local. They just let it go when they shouldn't.
The thing is that the most meaningful thing a president can do is stop a genocide, because the president has the power to stop a genocide without Congress having to do anything. Unlike, say, national health care, which requires a law from Congress. But the president doesn't do the thing that the president can do, because the president has too many vested interests in the way things are.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong.
There's a whole status quo that the government can't challenge, because the government is in service to this whole established way of doing things.
When you have Dick Cheney endorsing your candidacy, I mean, I can't comprehend how we went from George Bush and Dick Cheney are war criminals in 2008 being the common consensus among Democrats.
Well, the common consensus in 2008, I remember this well. The common consensus in 2008 was that people were pissed at Nancy Pelosi for not impeaching W, and really expected Obama's Justice Department to prosecute war criminals up to and including W himself. And of course, none of that ever happened. And Obama actively went out to reward the war criminals and put them in positions of power so that they could ensure that war crimes were never investigated.
And that to me is, we lose the moral, what's the word I'm looking for here? That directive. The thing
to remember is that John Brennan was the George W. Bush CIA official most responsible for things like rendition and torture. And John Brennan ended up becoming the face of Barack Obama's national security establishment and the director of Barack Obama's CIA.
And what concerns me is how regular people, went from parroting those lines, and believing it, to accepting whatever was given to them from the Democrats and changing their tune. To watch, it's the same thing that you saw happen with this election too. Nobody can replace Biden. That's the worst decision we can make. To, hey, maybe we should do someone other than Biden. Same people, same exact people, just different month, depending on what the plan was, right? So how do you take people like that seriously? They're clearly not engaging in real analysis. Anybody who had a brain could have told you running Biden for a second term was a bad idea. Everyone wanted a primary, and
whereas
all of these people that
whereas those of us who try to engage in real analysis get maybe 50, 60 views on YouTube. On that note, if you are still watching this show at this point and you are enjoying it and you intend to watch it again, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, share this somewhere on social media. We need people to get the message out. The show needs support. My streaming platform's pricing is going up. I need more subscribers in order to stay on the air past October the 15th. I'm at the point where I have to make decisions about how I'm running my platform because of the way the internet economy is changing, and because of how much harder it is to get really independent media out there. Please hit like, subscribe, share. We need your help. There aren't a bunch of other shows having folks like Seth on or talking about journalism being done by writers like Justine. So please help us out. Seth, do you have any final thoughts before I wrap us up?
I just tell people, please go to the nitrofiles.com. I'm going to have a teaser trailer out as soon as I get my audio interface shipped to me. My other one broken. That's why I asked you whenever I first got on. I asked him, I said, do I sound like a chipmunk? Because I did an interview with one of my experts, and when I played it back, I sound horrible. So once my equipment comes in, I should have some progress to share with everybody. But I hope that this is a success, and I hope that people take it as an opportunity to do more of this. Historical context is often used to exonerate people's past actions. And I don't want anyone to say, well, it was 2001, and we didn't really think about cloning. I want people to go back, re-examine this, and say, hey, wait a second. What almost happened? What was this? And so that's my goal. And I hope that we can see more of that. Malcolm Gladwell has revisionist history. I think that we need that from marginalized perspectives too. I think that we need to be looking at stories from the past and saying, what happened and does it have relevance to today, and what can we learn from it? So I'm excited about this project.
So I will say that for part of several final thoughts before wrapping up. Number one, my personal how can you organize and propagandize online thought for the day is, if you really want to make a difference, you should go out and ask right now, why is a guy who was involved in Nazi-esque experiments about human cloning likely to be the next auditor of the state of West Virginia? And just keep asking that question loudly where people will see it, because this is worth knowing. That's my first takeaway. Thank you, Seth, for sharing that beautiful nugget with us.
Well, thank you, Chris. I would never have said those things myself, but I can't argue with what you said there.
Second item is that, honestly, we need to think about how we can build a collectivism that includes the interests of our disabled comrades who have a great deal of thought and experience and wisdom to offer us that we often choose to ignore because of our own egos. The contribution of journalists like Justine Barron and Julia Doubleday, who understandably don't always have the spoons to come on a platform as small as mine when there are better uses for the spoons that they do have. We need to support them. We need to give a platform for people like that to use before they are ready for bigger platforms. And I need your help to continue to do that. You can follow us on Twitter at Eclectic Radical and The Eclectic Rad. You can support us on Patreon at Eclectic Radical. You can make one-time donations to Cash App at $ Eclectic Radical, or at Eclectic Radical on PayPal. I've made it really easy for people who want to help keep the show on the air. As a general rule, with a subscription goal of about $20 more a month. We are at $9 more a month, so we're still looking for another $11 more a month to be able to reliably stay on the air after October 15th. Please, if you can help do, there's not a lot of independent media. I want to keep giving people this alternative to Meet the Press and Face the Nation and the other commercial bullshit that people have on Sunday mornings. So please, if you like the show, support the show. Check out Seth's podcast. Talk about the fact that Mark Hunt was interested in Nazi-esque human cloning experiments and is now running for state auditor of West Virginia. And, talk about the fact that we need to be able to include disabled people in our spaces and that they have the same rights and expectations from society that the rest of us do. On that note, I will tweet at you, and please join us next week. Next week, my former co-host and another longtime friend of the show, Alex Suarez, returns for some more talk about foreign policy and what the evil empire is doing. Seth, thank you for joining me. Folks at home, thank you for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll tweet at you.